This is not a drill. We are sleepwalking into catastrophe. This is what we should be talking about right now. It's the most important domestic issue in this general election, but our politicians and our, frankly, largely dire media are shutting down the conversation. Now, we know our Prime Minister, well, for the next month anyway, Rishi Sunak lied through his teeth when he claimed that Labour's plans meant they were going to raise taxes on working families by £2,000 a year. Actually, it gets even worse for him because The Spectator, a hard-right publication, applied the same maths to the Conservative spending plans and found that would actually mean the Tories hiking taxes by £3,000 per household. Now, we could do one of two things in this election. We could spend our time debating lies, fiction, things which just are not true, or we could debate actual reality. So let's expose the big deceit of this election. And my next guest, the brilliant economist James Meadway, is the best person to do that with. He's the co-host of Macrodose, an exceptional podcast, which makes economics accessible. So please go and check that out and sign up. You won't regret it. This is important. Hey, James, how you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you, Owen?
Oh, yeah, just living my best life, I would say. Another day in paradise for this election campaign. What a real treat for all of us. Now, Labour are going to win the next election by a massive landslide. So let's just not bother discussing what the Conservatives do if they win again, because that is not going to happen. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, they have said both main parties are avoiding the reality that they are effectively signed up to sharp spending cuts while arguing over smaller changes to taxes and spending. Now, Alfie Sterling as well, who is the chief economist at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, previously at the New Economics Foundation, he says the real tax dishonesty is the silence over what happens if they don't rise. Answer, according to plans from both parties, either a further £20 billion a year in cuts to public services by 2029. That is close to the George Osborne cuts of the 2010 to 2015 era, or around £20 billion increase in borrowing, which is around £60 billion higher by 2029, which Labour have ruled out doing. Now, important caveat there, people might be thinking, what about the tax thresholds freeze, which is being banked in at the moment? There is a tax thresholds freeze, which means people are going to be dragged into paying more tax. Now, that's included in those figures. So with all this time at the moment, we're focusing on this lie, this raging lie by Rishi Sunak over Labour will increase taxes on working families by £2,000 a year. And now we're just revolving around, will they, is there a scandal of secret tax rises? When Labour have ruled out increasing income tax, including the top 5%, as well as VAT, which they shouldn't do, national insurance, and also corporation tax, which is the large majority of tax revenues. Yeah. So before I show you a clip of Rachel Reeves being interrogated by the centrist dad hero Rory Stewart, former Conservative MP, just tell us this is just massive austerity at the moment as things stand.
Yes, that's been the case for a while. It's been the case since Jeremy Hunt penciled it in back in the autumn statement at the end of 2023, which Labour kept very quiet about and has done nothing to say it would reverse or stop doing. The official line from Labour, by the way, is there will be no return to austerity. But as things stand, they are signed up to accept the Conservative Party's plans as laid out last year, which run through to 2028, which include, exactly as Alfie pointed out, this £20 billion worth of cuts, which is, like he says, it's the same as George Osborne did, but it comes on top of what George Osborne did. So the effect of this is very significantly worse. Now, look, I don't think any party in power can actually carry out those cuts, but that does then get you into okay, we're messing around with sort of somewhat made-up figures from the Conservative. People might have seen, by the way, Fraser Nelson, who edits The Spectator, the sort of hard-right Tory magazine, says, well, if we do the same trickery to the Conservatives' projections, it's a £3,000 tax rise they're talking about. I mean, the whole thing's just kind of slightly farcical. Fair enough for Labour to object to some of this, but it is missing this whacking great trumpeting elephant in the room, which is that all the parties, as things now stand, are signed up to cuts on the scale of what George Osborne proposed. And there's been absolutely no discussion of this. There's no discussion of all sorts of things we ought to be talking about in this election campaign. This is an enormous thing not to have discussed.
So just so everyone is completely clear about what we're actually talking about here, this is a black hole in finances, which is basically set in by the existing spending plans, which Jeremy Hunt, the Conservative Chancellor, not for long, he'll be looking to keep his seat, has already bedded in. So the question then is, that's what happens in the next coming Parliament.
Yes.
And you either, in that circumstance, you have a few options available to you. You can increase taxes, you can increase borrowing, you can print money.
Mm-hmm.
Is that your lot?
Or you could just do the cuts. You could just go,
If you want to avoid the cuts, sorry, if you want to avoid the cuts.
I mean, these are the basic things, and it's like, look, it's not even a very sophisticated bit of politics on the part of the Conservatives. They knew they've known for a long time they're probably not going to win the election, so they just shove everything off into the distance. That means they could claim last year that they were meeting their own sacred targets, their own fiscal rules and all this sort of nonsense, whilst actually dumping this huge, great political problem on Labour, who then have to deal with the consequences of it because they'd win the election almost certainly. What's happening right now is that Labour are failing to deal with the consequences of this, and it's going to start becoming, I think, a serious problem for them, because people are kind of starting to notice, like, after a while, people will pick up on the fact that you probably got £20 billion worth of cuts across the whole of government scheduled over the next Parliament or so. It is kind of the thing people notice, particularly, by the way, Labour supporters who absolutely do not expect that from the party that they're expected to go off and vote for.
Now, I'm just going to show a clip, which I actually just alarmed me, even though I knew that Labour, because of their rules on borrowing and on refusing to increase taxes on the well-to-do, I knew this was inevitable because I read what the Institute for Fiscal Studies have been saying, which should be the centrepiece of domestic policy in this general election campaign, but isn't, which just sums up, by the way, not just how awful our politicians are, but just how dire our media ecosystem actually is, because this is what they should be focusing on, which is the big black hole. How's it filled? Which services are going to be slashed if you don't raise taxes? That should be the absolute centre of what we're actually discussing in this entire election campaign. But it isn't. Instead, we're talking about fiction. Now, Rory Stewart is, of course, a former Conservative MP, and they came the hero of centrist dads. I never bought into that, Lovin, but at least he was asking some sensible, interesting questions of the shadow chancellor who's about to become the chancellor, Rachel Reeves.
And you're going to have to find, presumably, 3% above inflation every year for this year and every year to go to begin to keep up with the existing level of demand. How do we fund this? How do we keep... Education's easier than health.
I mean, this could have been said in 1997 as well. The NHS, you can't rescue it. It's not going to work.
We know what happened there.
Yeah,
but Gordon Brown borrowed an enormous amount of money, and then the 2008 financial crisis came around, and we ended up in a bit of trouble. So there is a way of doing this.
Well, wait a second. Like, what was borrowing? Just remind me what government debt was when Labour lost office in 2010, Rory. What was it as a percentage of GDP?
So there was a deficit running at 130 billion at the point where they went, right?
And debt as a share of GDP was 60%. What is it now, Rory?
Well, it's higher, but I'm
not.
not.
It's nearly 100% of GDP. So I don't need lectures, Rory. I don't need lectures from you.
I'm not particularly lecturing you. You're asking me how did they do it? They did it by borrowing a lot of money, and you're not going to do that.
Right, well, this government have borrowed a lot of money and things are an absolute mess. It's about how you run things. And that's why Wes talks about... You've asked a question.
Okay.
So it's also about how you run things. And that's why Wes has spoken about reform of public services rather than just money. But it's also why we've set out how we will tax the non-doms properly, which your party's had 14 years to do and never has.
Tiny amounts of money, Rachel. Tiny amounts.
$5 billion a year.
Tiny amounts for the NHS.
£5 billion is a small amount of money.
For what you need for the NHS,
come on,
yes.
Rory.
For what you need for the NHS,
well, we've committed to have 40,000 additional appointments every single week in the NHS. There's a backlog, as you know, under the Conservatives of almost 8 million today. It's not going to sort out everything overnight. If I promised to do that, I think people would rightly say that's not possible. But we're setting out the steps we're going to take to get the NHS fit for the future again. And we'll start with those additional appointments.
So, James, just on that, I mean, it was marred, the questioning, by Rory Stewart's erroneous narrative on the financial crash, firstly, which we don't buy into. Obviously, it wasn't a question of Labour spending too much money. It was a question of the lack of regulation of the banks and then a collapse in tax revenues and then automatic stabulus kicking in. So you had to obviously increase money on people losing jobs, that kind of thing. But in any case, just erase that. What alarmed me was, he's absolutely right. What Rachel Reeves is talking about in terms of tax is a pittance. It's a drop in the ocean when she's talking about non-doms. I listened to that. It sounded like there isn't actually a plan in a drawer. That's what worried me when I heard that. It just sounded like they have no plan whatsoever for the fact that massive cuts are looming unless they raise taxes on some people.
I mean, it was not the most. I mean, she started, well, actually, fair enough to Rachel Reeves, I suppose. She started pushing back on the whole claim about Labour overspending, but that did not answer the question she was actually put, which is like, what are you going to do? And pointing at non-doms, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is a bit of money and it's a good thing to do, and it's an obvious loophole. But like, this is not £20 billion worth of cash you can suddenly find all at once. Now, interest a year. Yeah. No, exactly. It's not over the Parliament. This is this is like in 1 year you're going to have to find it. The difficulty that they've run into, and I think you're starting to see at least some recognition on the Labour side of this, is, for example, The Guardian running a story earlier today that was, oh, well, there's pressure on Rachel Reeves to increase capital gains tax, which, I mean, the IPPR, Institute for Public Policy Research, costings for a few years ago said it's like £90 billion over 5 years. It's starting to get you into the kinds of money you need to not have these massive great cuts happening. By the way, none of this is getting you into what you need to spend to actually improve things. And this is where stuff becomes really like sort of catastrophic. I mean, the NHS repair bill alone is £12 billion. That is the backlog to do everything from a lick of paint on some corridor walls to actually repairing ceilings that are in serious danger of collapse throughout the hospitals throughout the country. So that's what needs to be spent just to get the NHS kind of patched up. It's not like building new hospitals. This is taking the stuff we got now and fixing it. £12 billion. We're not even close to that with this 20 billion. That's getting stuff back to what it might have been like a few years ago. I mean, the extraordinary thing, if you look at the Institute for Government, where they say, well, basically, yeah, we had austerity for years and years, and then Boris Johnson sort of increased spending a bit. And basically, at best, in some public services, it's almost as good as it was in 2010. I mean, it's like, this is an incredible situation. There has been essentially no progress whatsoever at best over the last 14 years. And obviously on parts of the welfare state, on major parts of things like local governments, things are dramatically worse. And in most cases, things are significantly worse than they were in 2010. Now, that's where we've got to. This is a rich country, if you're in Britain. It is. It's just the money is all held by a very few people. Labour has no story about how it's going to go after those people. I suspect that the story laid out in the Guardian article, that they'll try and do an emergency type budget. It's a big disaster. The Tories are so bad. They'll try and do that in the autumn and use that as an excuse to more or less do what they want. It will probably include some tax rises of some kind, but it's likely to also include some spending cuts of another kind. And they will be tempted to try and change some of the rules on how the Bank of England is currently indemnified by the Treasury for losses it makes on quantitative easing, and that could be potentially quite a large amount of money they'll sort of conjure up out of there. Not quite a magic money tree, but it would, if you're sitting in the Treasury, start to look like one. So they might, by the autumn, start to make this work. The problem is that's not something we're actually discussing now. We're in an election where you're supposed to set what the government will be doing, what it will talk about for the next 5 years or so. What we're actually doing is sort of waiting to see what they'll come up with, in a supposed emergency situation once we get to autumn or so this year. There's no democratic discussion right now of what that government will be doing or what it's really going to do over the longer term, because actually we're talking about 5 years from now where this spending has to happen. That's not being discussed now. Instead, there's just this sort of weird £2,000 tax rise nonsense from the Tories and Labour flapping about that instead.
I mean, before just asking about that, just in terms of the autumn, I mean, just be clear about the taxes. I mean, Sophie Ridge, to her credit at Sky News, is one of the only journalists to have raised this, to say, well, actually, everyone's talking about this lie by Rishi Sunak, when actually she said, by ruling out tax increases, VAT, which we don't want them to raise, that's regressive, and it's a tax on consumptions. We prefer that in an ideal world to be lower, not higher. Income tax, including on the top 5%, but also national insurance, that together is 60% of all tax revenue. Corporation tax as well, they ruled out an increase. They said this is basically the ceiling, and actually ideally they'd like it to fall. So I don't know how much corporation tax is, but it's another significant chunk of tax revenue. Capital gains tax she's previously ruled out. I actually did try and check, because sometimes there's this kind of sneaky formulation politicians use, which has no plans to. Because I think David Cameron did that in the general election about VAT. I think he said the Tories had no plans to increase VAT. And then they did increase VAT from 17.5% to 20%, quite notoriously at the time. I think they passed that off partly as negotiating a coalition, though. But is your view basically that, so we could come to the autumn and they'd go, guys, we've opened the box. It is way worse than we think. we're going to have to take drastic measures, and they'll have a majority of something, I don't know, the Bath Party would have been envious of. They're going to get like 90% of the seats at this rate, according to some of the polls, where the Tories lucky if they, at this rate, if they have a higher percentage than Reform. So on that basis, do you think they could just get away with, but I mean, that would mean capital gains. Just be clear to people, what is capital gains and what does equalising, what we're talking about here?
Okay, so capital gains tax is the tax you pay over a certain limit, quite low limit, on something like you buy an antique and then you sell it at a profit, right? Or you have a second or third or fourth home. It's tax on an asset like that when you make a capital gain and when you dispose of the asset and realise that capital gain. In other words, you get the money, you make the profit. So as you can imagine, it's actually a tax only paid by really a very small number of people. Almost all of us will rarely see capital gains tax. If you're doing something like you're regularly trading shares and you're trading a lot of them and you're making a lot of money, you'll start to see capital gains tax. If you're involved in certain kinds of private equity dealings, this sort of thing, you start to bump into it. You're talking about the top end of the income scale who pay this tax. So increases in it tend to hit only the very top. What's happened with capital gains taxes, which is mightily peculiar when you start to think about it, is that the rate you're paying on the capital gains you make on selling a valuable artwork or something like this is much lower than the rate of tax you pay on money you get from actually doing some work, right? It's a peculiar thing that's happened. It's kind of Labour's fault, by the way, that this exists, but that's a longer story. That's opened up and it's obviously unfair. Why should money that you earn from doing an actual job be taxed more highly than if you happen to be day trading shares and doing very well at it, or disposing your fourth home or something like this, right, at a profit? Why should that be taxed differently? If you equalise those two tax rates, the gains to be made are pretty substantial. The figure from the IPPR, from memory, is about £90 billion over 5 years or so. And you can go backwards and forwards about how much it would actually be, but it's substantial and it's sitting there and it's an obvious injustice. It's such an obvious injustice that Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, did this in 1986 because he said it's simply not fair to have these two taxes at a different rate. If it's good enough for Nigel Lawson in 1986, it is surely good enough for Rachel Reeves, a Labour Chancellor, to be in 2024.
Because the way he did that was to sweeten the fact they decreased income tax from 60% to 40% by going, but at the same time, we'll equalise capital gains with income tax. So like, oh, look how fair we are. But clearly, but it was actually Labour who cut it in subsequent budgets. Oh my God.
Unbelievable, really, but there we are.
Yeah, you look back and you kind of think, when people go, oh, why are you being so critical of Labour? And then you kind of look at things they've done in the past, you think, well, look at that, for God's sake. Is another way around it, I mean, that they could, think that they could fiddle with certain bank rules.
Yeah, that's this Bank of England business. This is the peculiar thing where, without going too much into it, because it gets gnarly around some of the details, but basically having done 800, 900 billion pounds worth of quantitative easing over the last 15 or so years since 2009. So the Bank of England's printing money and buying up government debt. For the first part of that, because it was holding the debt, it was actually making money on it. It was kind of getting interest payments because you got the debt. And when interest rates were low, it was making a profit out of this. Now that interest rates have risen, because of how the accounting works, the Bank of England is making losses. And there was an agreement signed with the Bank of England, with the Treasury, and you're going back to the 2010s now, 2009 to 2010, where the Treasury agrees to indemnify losses the Bank of England makes. In other words, the Treasury gets its money and pays the Bank of England for losses it is making now that interest rates have risen on quantitative easing. Now, not many other big central banks around the world do this. The Federal Reserve doesn't do this. The Swiss National Bank doesn't do this. The European Central Bank, if memory serves, doesn't do this either. So it's a bit weird that we've got this kind of prop for the Bank of England, who's then, by the way, paying money to other banks and financial institutions with this money we're indemnifying them for. That's where this money is ending up. It's a bit weird that we're doing this as basically a kind of free gift for the Bank of England and the banks it is paying this money to. There's no real reason to continue doing this if other people don't do it. You could get rid of that. Payments over the last year came to about £40 billion. So it's significant. They'll fall over the next few years if interest rates come down, but nonetheless, it's substantial. So there is something to be done there, right? There is something that a chancellor sitting in number 10 or number 11, if they're new in the desk, they can say, right, we're going to do this and change it, and it'll happen. The reason not to do that, and it's the only reason, and it's a bad reason, is that the banks don't like it. Now, What have Labour been saying about the banks? Well, we love the banks. We love financial services. They're so important. We're going to look after them. And that is the only reason, really, to not make this simple change that will release a huge amount of resources for the Treasury and allow at least some of that big old gap in public spending to be filled.
Just the other thing, I mean, you made a really important point that when we're talking about cuts, we're talking about cuts on top of the legacy of the other cuts. Yes. So plus we have a population that's grown and there are additional pressures as a consequence. As things stand, that's what we're heading for. That's what's bedded in. And Labour haven't presented anything which solves that. And they've ruled out various tax measures which would. Previously, she has ruled out equalising capital gains tax and wealth taxes full stop. But I mean, at the other point, if they suddenly she changes tack on that, isn't there the question of, like, if we were going to do a critique of, well, I was going to say if we're going to do a critique of Liz Truss, I think we'd do a critique of Liz Truss. But I mean, one of the things she did is go like, boo, to the market. There was no build up. So you can't really, like, isn't there a problem with just, if they suddenly had something up their sleeves, you can't really just surprise the market, and they've kind of had to make that clear. You have to build, you have to lay the foundations.
I mean, this will be weighing on their minds very heavily. Every sort of Labour chancellor who arrives in office has this thing where, like, don't spook the markets. This is why Gordon Brown did this thing of making the Bank of England independent, more or less as soon as he arrived in office in 1997, a way of calming the financial system down, along with all the deregulation, all the stuff that basically set the ground for the disaster of 2007, 2008. But that's what he did because he didn't want that panic. Rachel Reeves, I'd be astonished if she wasn't thinking exactly the same way in this. And that means you're not going to get something like, almost certainly not actually going to get something like, let's change the accountancy rules in the Bank of England to the extent that you could. You might get some fiddling about with it. You probably won't get the shift in taxes that you might want to do the additional spending. You might get some part of it. My guess is they'll try and do something that will look clever if you're sitting in the Treasury, which is sort of square several circles all at once, a few little cuts there, some efficiency savings over here, bit of a tax rise there. Probably, I'd have thought, end up actually impressing and satisfying no one, but that feels like what you're going to get with this Labour government is something that impresses or satisfies no one. It's got that kind of written all over it as things stand.
Which is why I would, I suppose, end by saying Labour are going to win a massive landslide anyway. Might as well vote with your conscience, vote Green, unless you've got a good left-wing Labour candidate or an independent candidate, because the more people who vote Green, the more pressure it puts on Labour to do things like tax the rich and invest in public services. Anyway, I just put that out because I have to keep doing that during the general election campaign. Please, everyone, do make sure you sign up to Macrodose and support Macrodose. I'll put the link in the bio because then you can just get loads more of this amazing wisdom from James, which we need during this election, because at the moment, the media is denying us the discussion, the debate we should be having, which is a massive black hole, which means in practice, huge cuts to public services on top of the cuts we've already had when the country is already falling to pieces, in many cases, literally. So do like and leave comments. Good for the algorithm. More people listen. Do share. Listen to the podcast. But James, thank you so much.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.